My name is Madison, 33 years old, and my fiancé had absolutely no idea that the shy, broke administrative assistant he thought he was marrying was actually the chief operating officer of a major venture capital firm earning $100,000 a month. When Brendan invited me to his family's extravagant Thanksgiving dinner, I wanted to see exactly how they would treat a nobody. So I wore my oldest, most faded coat and kept my head down. I expected some snide comments or maybe a cold shoulder. What I did not expect was the moment his mother stopped. The entire dinner service stared me dead in the eyes and slid a thick legal contract across the table right next to the roasted turkey. Sign it. We do not let gold diggers into this family. Before I tell you exactly what was in that insulting document and how I destroyed their entire world, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to hide your true power just to expose someone else's true colors. To understand how we reached this point, you need to understand the Cole family. They were the epitome of fake old money. Brendan was a tech startup CEO who drove a leased Porsche and talked a big game about his upcoming funding rounds. His mother Beatrice carried herself like royalty in their massive suburban mansion, completely obsessed with appearances and status. His sister Ashley was just as bad, constantly flaunting designer bags funded entirely by her husband Jamal. Jamal was a brilliant marketing director and a hard-working African-American man who somehow ended up trapped in their toxic web of superiority. I always sensed their subtle judgments, the way Beatrice would look at my inexpensive shoes or how Ashley would loudly pity my generic handbag. But I never reacted. In my world of high-stakes corporate finance, information is the ultimate currency. Letting my opponents underestimate me was my favorite strategy. So when we arrived at the Cole family mansion that Thursday evening, I played my part perfectly. I walked through their grand double doors wearing a 5-year-old faded wool coat I bought on clearance at Target. The atmosphere in this house was incredibly tense and painfully pretentious. Crystal glasses caught the light of a massive chandelier. Classical music played softly in the background. Beatrice had hired caterers so she would not have to lift a finger, yet she barked orders at them as if they were peasants. When I took off my coat, Ashley let out a very audible, condescending sigh. She whispered something to Brendan about my thrift store aesthetic. He just nervously adjusted his tie and refused to look at me. That was the first red flag. The man who claimed to love me was already shrinking in the presence of his overbearing mother. We sat down at the lavishly decorated dining table. The silver platters were arranged perfectly, the wine was pouring, but nobody was talking to me. I was treated like a ghost haunting their perfect holiday portrait. Then came the moment that changed everything. The caterers had just placed the massive golden turkey in the center of the table. I reached for my water glass, trying to maintain my polite smile. Suddenly, the heavy dining room doors slammed shut. Beatrice stood up from the head of the table. She did not offer a toast. She did not say what she was thankful for. Instead, she reached onto the serving cart beside her and pulled out a stack of paper thicker than a phone book. She dropped it directly onto the glass dining table with a loud thud. It was a 50-page legal document bound with a heavy black clip. She pushed it hard across the table. It slid over the polished glass and stopped right next to my plate, knocking over my water glass. The cold water spilled onto my lap, but Beatrice did not even blink. She leaned forward, her perfectly manicured hands gripping the edge of the table, her voice dripping with pure venom. Sign it. We do not let gold diggers into this family. The silence that followed was absolute. Every single judgmental eye in the dining room turned to look at me. The hired caterers froze in their tracks by the kitchen door. My chest tightened, not from fear, but from the sheer audacity of this woman. I looked down at the thick stack of papers ruining the holiday table setting. The front page boldly stated it was an ironclad prenuptial agreement drafted by one of the most ruthless law firms in the city. They truly believed I was a desperate woman, trying to secure a future through their precious son. The irony was so profound, it almost made me laugh out loud. If they only knew the truth. I let my eyes wander around the dining room, taking in every detail of the Cole family facade. They paraded around like they were American royalty, dripping in what they desperately wanted people to believe was generational wealth. But my trained eyes saw right through the polished veneer. I spent my days analyzing balance sheets and assessing corporate risk. I knew exactly what fake old money looked like. The massive chandelier hanging above us was beautiful, but the house itself was completely devoid of personal history. There were no heirloom portraits, no antique rugs passed down through generations. It was a showroom financed to the hilt. Beatrice wore a designer dress from last season, likely bought at a steep discount, yet she carried herself as if she owned the entire neighborhood. Ashley sat there with a smug expression, her wrists weighed down by flashy jewelry that Jamal had undoubtedly paid for by working 80-hour weeks. They projected an image of absolute financial superiority, completely unaware that their entire lifestyle was a house of cards built on massive credit card debt and leveraged assets. And then there was me. I looked down at my scuffed leather boots and the frayed cuffs of my cheap sweater. I had intentionally worn my most worn-out clothes, leaving my tailored designer suits and diamond jewelry locked away in my luxury penthouse. I wanted to see the real Brendan and his family. I wanted to strip away the influence of my wealth and see how they treated a woman who had nothing to offer them but love and loyalty. The contrast between my humble appearance and their aggressive ostentation was exactly what I had engineered. But seeing the trap snap shut in real time was still deeply unsettling. I slowly lifted my gaze from the prenuptial agreement and looked directly at Brendan. He was 34 years old, the chief executive officer of his own technology startup, a man who constantly bragged about his leadership skills and his ability to command a boardroom. I expected him to look shocked. I expected him to push his chair back, stand up, and snatch that insulting document off the table. I waited for the man I loved to raise his voice and defend the woman he had asked to marry him. I waited for him to tell his mother that her behavior was completely unacceptable and that he would not tolerate such blatant disrespect toward his future wife. Instead, he did the exact opposite. Brendan physically shrank into his heavily upholstered dining chair. His broad shoulders slumped. He reached out with a trembling hand and picked up his crystal glass of expensive red wine. He took a long, slow sip, intentionally looking anywhere but at me. He stared at the roasted turkey. He stared at the floral centerpiece. He stared at the intricate patterns carved into the ceiling molding. But he absolutely refused to meet my eyes. His cowardice was a physical weight pressing down on the room. That silence was the loudest sound I had ever heard. It was not just a lack of words. It was a complete and utter betrayal. In that agonizing stretch of time while Beatrice glared at me with triumph and Ashley smirked with undisguised malice, Brendan abandoned me. He was perfectly willing to let his family publicly humiliate me as long as it kept him in her extremely good graces. He wanted the comfort of her approval more than he wanted to protect my dignity. My heart did not break in that moment. It hardened. All the affection and the future plans I had built around this man evaporated into thin air. I realized that Brendan was not the strong visionary partner he pretended to be. He was a weak, easily manipulated boy hiding behind a fancy job title and a leased luxury car. He was terrified of losing his inheritance, an inheritance I knew for a fact was largely an illusion. The conflict was no longer just about a piece of paper on a table. It was about the fundamental truth of who these people were. They were predators testing the waters to see how much abuse their new victim would tolerate. And Brendan was the bait that had lured me into the trap. I took a deep breath, smoothing my hands over my cheap clothes, letting the final shreds of my shy persona fall away in my mind. I refused to be a victim today. My silence was over. It was time to show them the monster they had invited inside. They wanted a game of financial dominance. They had no idea who they were actually playing against right now. Before I could even process the full weight of the document in front of me, Ashley decided it was her turn to twist the knife. She leaned back in her heavily upholstered chair, twirling a thick diamond tennis bracelet around her wrist with a sickeningly sweet smile. "Honestly, Madison," she purred, her tone dripping with fake sympathy, You should be thanking my mother. We all know how much you struggle. Brendan told me you are just a low-level admin at some nameless corporate office downtown. What do you make, 50,000 a year? 60 if you are lucky and work overtime. She let out a dramatic laugh that echoed against the crystal wine glasses. You have to understand that our family operates on a completely different financial level. Just last month, Jamal and I spent $20,000 on a quick weekend trip to St. Bart's. That is probably half your entire annual salary blown in 3 days. We cannot just let someone with your background marry into our wealth without protecting our assets. It is nothing personal. People like you do not understand the pressure of maintaining a legacy. I glanced over at Jamal. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, looking down at his expensive porcelain plate. He was the one actually funding Ashley's ridiculous shopping sprees and island vacations through his grueling hours as a marketing director. Yet Ashley spoke as if she had built a financial empire with her own bare hands. She went on without taking a breath, listing her recent luxury purchases with the enthusiasm of a spoiled teenager. She bragged about her new imported sports car, her exclusive country club membership, and the custom designer gowns she was having imported directly from Italy for the upcoming winter gala season. Every single word she spoke was meticulously designed to make me feel small, to remind me that I was a worthless peasant sitting at the grand table of royalty. She desperately wanted me to look at her with a mixture of intense envy and profound desperation. Beatrice sat rigidly at the head of the long table, nodding along with her daughter, her cold eyes locked entirely onto my face, waiting eagerly for the first tear of defeat to fall. They both thrived on this specific kind of toxic psychological warfare. They wanted to utterly break my spirit before the main course was even served. But I did not break. I did not cry. I did not even frown. Instead, I calmly picked up my linen napkin, unfolded it, and placed it on my lap. I reached for my overturned water glass, righted it, and used a corner of my napkin to dab the spilled water off the tablecloth. I kept my movements precise, elegant, and completely unbothered by their vicious attacks. I looked directly into Ashley's eyes and offered her a small, polite smile. "St. Bart's is lovely this time of year," I said softly, my voice steady and completely devoid of any negative emotion. "I am truly glad you had a nice vacation, Ashley." The absolute lack of intimidation in my voice caught them entirely off guard. Ashley's smug expression faltered for a fraction of a second. She exchanged a quick, confused look with her mother. This was not the script they had written in their heads. In their twisted minds, the poor administrative assistant should be sobbing by now. I should be begging Brendan to defend my honor, pleading with Beatrice to accept my meager existence, or running out the front door in tears of shame. My absolute composure acted like a sudden splash of highly flammable gasoline on a roaring open fire. Beatrice's face flushed with a suddenly deep, dark red anger. Her jaw clenched so tight I thought her teeth might shatter. She hated the fact that she could not control my emotional state. It infuriated her beyond belief that her grand, humiliating gesture had not reduced me to a trembling mess. If anything, my eerie calmness made them look unhinged and foolish. Beatrice leaned heavily over the table, abandoning her aristocratic posture, her voice dropping to a harsh, grating whisper that carried across the silent room. "Do not try to play these psychological games with me. You are sitting right now in a massive luxury house you could never afford to step foot in under normal circumstances. My son is the CEO of a rising technology firm, and you are nothing but a glorified secretary who files paperwork and fetches coffee for people more important than you. You bring absolutely no financial or social value to this table. The contract sitting in front of you is the only generous offer you will ever receive from this family. Pick up a pen and sign your name right now. Otherwise, you can get up and walk back to whatever miserable apartment you crawled out of." The echo of her harsh words hung in the stagnant air of the dining room. No one dared to breathe. Beatrice sat back, crossing her arms, wearing the satisfied expression of a predator who had just cornered its prey. It was at this exact moment that Jamal finally decided to intervene. He shifted in his seat, the leather of the dining chair creaking loudly in the quiet room. Jamal was 35 years old and an incredibly sharp man. As a highly successful African-American executive who had climbed the corporate ladder through sheer grit and intelligence, he knew how to read a room. But years of being married to Ashley and dealing with Beatrice had worn him down. He had adopted a strategy of appeasement just to survive the holidays. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, and looked at me with genuine but deeply misguided sympathy. "Look, Madison." Jamal said, his deep voice smooth and carefully measured to avoid setting off his mother-in-law. "Just sign it. Do not make this harder than it has to be." He offered a small, tired smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "If it makes you feel any better, I had to do the exact same thing. When I asked Ashley to marry me, Beatrice made me sit in her private study and present 5 years of tax returns, my investment portfolios, and a comprehensive credit report before she even let me buy the ring. I had to prove my financials to Beatrice, too. It is nothing personal against you. It is just business. They just want to make sure everything is properly documented." I looked at Jamal, truly seeing the exhaustion behind his expensive tailored suit. He meant well, or at least he thought he did. In his mind, he was throwing me a life preserver. But in reality, he was just showing me the heavy iron chains he had willingly wrapped around his own ankles. He had surrendered his dignity to be accepted by these people, allowing a woman who contributed nothing to society to audit his hard-earned success. He had convinced himself it was normal to be degraded for love. I did not feel angry at Jamal. I felt a profound sense of pity for him. He had so much potential, yet he was wasting his life funding the delusions of a family that secretly viewed him as nothing more than a highly profitable asset. I let his words hang in the air for a moment. Then I executed the next phase of my plan. I allowed my posture to soften. I dropped my shoulders just a fraction of an inch and let out a long, shaky sigh, perfectly mimicking the body language of a woman who had finally realized she was completely outmatched. I looked down at my hands, which were resting neatly on my lap, and then slowly raised my eyes to look at the thick stack of legal papers. The heavy black clip binding the 50 pages together looked like a lock on a prison door. A very slow, incredibly cold smile crept onto my lips, though I kept my head angled down so they would misinterpret it as a smile of nervous surrender. I reached my hands out and placed my fingertips on the edges of the document. The heavy paper felt rough against my skin. I pulled the contract across the smooth glass table, sliding it directly in front of my plate, right next to my silver cutlery. I flattened the top page with the palm of my hand, smoothing out a small crease near the edge. "Do you happen to have a pen?" I asked softly. The immediate shift in the room was palpable. The suffocating tension evaporated in an instant, replaced by a wave of arrogant relief. Beatrice let out a short, triumphant breath, her posture instantly relaxing into that of a victorious queen. She shot a knowing, smug look over at Ashley, who was already raising her wineglass to her lips to hide her cruel grin. Even Brendan the coward, who had ignored me this entire time, finally turned his head to look at me. His shoulders dropped, and a sickeningly sweet smile spread across his face. He actually looked proud, as if he had successfully trained a disobedient pet. He thought he had won. They all thought they had successfully broken me, forcing the poor administrative assistant to sign away her rights just for the privilege of sitting at their table. Beatrice snapped her fingers at Brendan, gesturing eagerly for him to provide the writing instrument that would seal my fate. They were so blinded by their own arrogance that they completely failed to notice the absolute lack of fear in my eyes. Brendan reached into his perfectly tailored suit jacket and pulled out a sleek silver pen. He handed it to me with a deeply condescending smirk, expecting me to quickly scribble my name on the dotted line without reading a single word. That was how these people operated. They demanded blind obedience. I took the pen, but I did not uncap it. Instead, I set it down gently beside my dinner plate. I took a slow breath and flipped open the heavy black cover of the legal document. "What are you doing?" Beatrice snapped. Her triumphant smile vanished, replaced by a deep scowl that etched harsh lines into her forehead. "Just sign the last page, Madison. The turkey is getting cold." "I always read what I sign, Beatrice," I replied evenly. My voice was no longer soft or hesitant. It resonated with the crisp, authoritative tone I used every single day to command boardrooms filled with millionaire investors. I turned past the title page to Section 3 and began to read aloud, projecting my voice clearly across the massive dining room. "Section 4, Subsection B," I read, keeping my eyes locked on the thick paper. "In the event of a dissolution of marriage, the secondary party being Madison Reed, hereby waives any and all rights to spousal support, alimony, or maintenance, regardless of the duration of the marriage or any career sacrifices made." I paused and looked directly at Brendan. "Zero alimony. Fascinating. So if I stay home to raise our hypothetical children for 10 years and you decide to leave me for someone else, I walk away with absolutely nothing." Brendan shifted uncomfortably, tugging at his stiff collar. "It is just standard legal protection, Madison. My lawyers insisted on it. You know how the family courts can be. Standard protection," I echoed flatly, turning another thick page. The crisp sound of the paper flipping seemed to echo in the silent room. Section 7, Property Division. "The secondary party agrees to forfeit all claims to any marital assets acquired during the marriage, including but not limited to real estate vehicles and investment portfolios, which will remain the property of Brendan Cole." Ashley let out a loud theatrical sigh and rolled her eyes. "Oh, please, Madison. Stop being so dramatic. You do not bring any valuable assets into this marriage anyway. Why should you get to take half of my brother's hard-earned wealth if things do not work out? It is called protecting the family legacy." "Right. The great family legacy," I said smoothly. "Let us talk about protecting that legacy." I flipped past a dozen pages, scanning the dense legal jargon until I found the specific clause I knew would be hidden inside. These types of controlling contracts always contained a mechanism for ultimate daily domination. Ah, here it is. Section 12, Financial Oversight. I looked directly at Beatrice, whose face had gone dangerously pale. She did not expect me to understand the legal terminology, let alone read it out loud. "The secondary party agrees to submit to mandatory financial coaching to ensure lifestyle compatibility with the Cole family standards," I read, pronouncing every word with agonizing clarity. "Furthermore, the secondary party shall submit all weekly expenditure reports, including grocery receipts, personal shopping invoices, and utility bills, to a designated family financial supervisor, named herein as Beatrice Cole, for immediate review and approval." Jamal let out a sharp, genuine laugh of pure disbelief from across the table. He quickly slapped a hand over his mouth, but the damage was already done. The sheer absurdity of the demand had broken through his carefully practiced diplomacy. Ashley glared at him furiously, but Jamal just shook his head and stared at his plate. I set the document down and folded my hands neatly on top of it. "Weekly grocery receipts, Beatrice. You seriously want me to hand you my grocery receipts every Sunday so you can audit what kind of breakfast cereal I am allowed to eat in my own kitchen?" Beatrice slammed her hand flat against the polished glass table. "You have absolutely no understanding of wealth management. You come from nothing. If my successful son is going to elevate you into this lavish lifestyle, I need to ensure you do not squander his valuable resources on frivolous garbage. You need strict guidance. You need firm boundaries." "I need boundaries," I repeated quietly. The blatant hypocrisy was almost suffocating. This arrogant woman who was actively draining her family accounts to maintain a pathetic facade of high society wealth was demanding the legal right to micromanage my daily grocery expenses. She wanted to treat me like a teenager with a restricted allowance. They thought they had trapped a naive girl who would eagerly trade her autonomy for a shiny ring. This contract proved everything. I pushed my chair back from the table just enough to give myself room to breathe. I dropped my shoulders, straightened my spine, and completely abandoned the timid, shrinking posture I had maintained since walking through their front door. I looked at Beatrice with the exact same expression I used when rejecting a poorly structured term sheet from a desperate startup founder. "This document is not just insulting Beatrice," I said, my voice slicing through the heavy air with absolute authority. "It is fundamentally flawed and legally unenforceable. In fact, if you tried to bring this into a courtroom, any competent judge would throw it out and likely sanction the attorney who drafted it for professional misconduct." Brendan blinked rapidly, completely taken aback by my sudden shift in tone. "What are you talking about, Madison?" he stammered. "It is a standard contract." "There is absolutely nothing standard about this," I fired back, tapping my index finger against the heavy paper. "Let us start with Section 8, subsection C, regarding the waiver of all marital assets. In this state, any prenuptial agreement that leaves one party completely destitute upon divorce, while the other retains 100% of the assets acquired during the marriage, is highly vulnerable to being struck down as unconscionable. A court will not enforce a contract that creates a ward of the state." I flipped to another page, not even looking up as I continued my analysis. "Then there is Section 15. You included a penalty clause stating I would owe the Cole family $100,000 if I ever speak negatively about your family legacy in public. That is a blatant violation of basic First Amendment protections and is entirely unenforceable in civil court without a proven monetized defamation claim. It is an intimidation tactic, not a legal parameter. And do not even get me started on the severability clause or lack thereof." Ashley was staring at me with her mouth slightly open. Her heavily glossed lips parted, but no sound came out. She looked like a fish gasping for air. She glanced at her mother, then back at me, her brain clearly short-circuiting. "How do you know any of that?" Ashley finally blurted out, her voice shrill and defensive. "You are an administrative assistant. You file paperwork. You do not know anything about civil litigation or contract law." I ignored her completely and kept my eyes locked on Brendan. "Did you actually pay a licensed attorney to draft this garbage, Brendan?" I asked coldly. "Or did you just download a cheap template from the internet and have your mother fill in the blanks with her wildest control fantasies?" Beatrice slammed her hand on the table again, the crystal glasses rattling violently. "How dare you speak to my son that way? You are a low-level secretary. You have no right to question our legal counsel. We hired the best firm in the city to protect our assets from women exactly like you. If you paid a top-tier firm for this, you should demand a refund," I replied smoothly, leaning forward and resting my forearms on the table. "Because Section 22 clearly violates state labor laws. You stipulate that any intellectual property or business concepts I develop during the marriage automatically become the sole property of Brendan Cole. That is not just illegal, it is laughable. You cannot use a family court document to override federal copyright and patent protections. Any first-year law student could tell you that." The confusion in the room was palpable. They had expected a weeping, helpless victim. Instead, they were facing a corporate shark, dissecting their trap with surgical precision. Brendan looked terrified. He was looking at me as if I were a complete stranger who had suddenly possessed his fiancé. He opened his mouth to speak, but shut it again, completely out of his depth. He had never heard me use words like unconscionable or intellectual property. Jamal was the only one who seemed to grasp the gravity of what was happening. He sat up completely straight, his eyes darting between me and the contract. As a corporate executive himself, he recognized the language. He recognized the cadence of someone who read complex legal agreements for a living. He leaned slightly toward Brendan. "She is right, Brendan," Jamal muttered quietly, his tone deadly serious. "That intellectual property clause is completely void. It would never hold up in mediation. Where did you even get this thing?" "Shut up, Jamal!" Beatrice hissed, her face contorted in a mix of fury and panic. "She is just repeating things she overheard her bosses saying at work. She does not actually understand any of this. She is trying to confuse us with big words." I smiled, a genuine, terrifying smile. Oh, Beatrice, I understand it perfectly. But we have not even gotten to the best part yet. I have saved the most ridiculous clause for last. I picked up the document one last time and flipped to the very back, finding the final addendum. This was the moment I was going to expose the true depth of their greed. They wanted to play a game of legal intimidation, but they had left a massive glaring vulnerability right out in the open. I looked at the three of them, watching their arrogant certainty crumble into deep, uncomfortable confusion. "You thought you were so clever," I said softly. "But this contract is not about protecting your wealth. It is about stealing mine." Beatrice's face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated outrage. "Stealing," she shrieked, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. "How dare you accuse us of such a thing? You are nothing but an ungrateful little brat who does not understand the complexities of high finance. You think you can read a few legal terms and suddenly outsmart the most prestigious law firm in the state. I will show you exactly how foolish you are." She snatched her expensive smartphone from the table, her hands shaking with rage. "I am calling our lead attorney right now. He will put you in your place and explain exactly why every single word in this document is completely ironclad." Beatrice jabbed aggressively at her phone screen, hit the speaker button, and slammed the device back down onto the glass table. It rang twice before a deep, arrogant voice answered. "Beatrice, happy Thanksgiving. To what do I owe the pleasure of a phone call on a holiday? Mr. Kensington." Beatrice barked, leaning over the device. "I am sitting here with my son's fiancé. She is refusing to sign the agreement. She has the absolute audacity to claim that your contract is illegal and unenforceable. Please explain to this ignorant girl that she has no legal ground to stand on and that she needs to sign it immediately." Kensington let out a slow, condescending chuckle that grated against my ears. "Of course, Beatrice. Put the young lady on." He cleared his throat loudly. "Miss Reed, is it? I understand you might find the legal terminology a bit intimidating. The law is very complex for those outside the profession. But I assure you, this is a standard protective measure for a family of this immense stature. If you sign it now, we can all go back to enjoying our holiday turkey. If you refuse, I can assure you that no family court will ever look favorably upon your financial greed." I leaned closer to the phone, keeping my posture perfectly straight. "Mr. Kensington," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerously calm octave. "Since we are on a recorded line, I want to clarify your professional position. Are you formally stating as a licensed member of the State Bar that a prenuptial agreement requiring the total forfeiture of all marital assets without any consideration while simultaneously demanding the transfer of personal intellectual property is a legally sound document? Because if so, I would love to send this exact audio transcript directly to the Ethics Committee for a comprehensive review." The line went completely dead silent. The condescending chuckle evaporated instantly. "Excuse me?" Kensington stammered, his confident tone faltering. "Who exactly am I speaking with right now?" "You are speaking with someone who knows that embedding a predatory commercial loan disguised as a marital agreement violates at least 3 separate federal financial regulations." I fired back, not giving him a single second to recover. Section 24 clearly attempts to leverage my personal real estate to secure a corporate loan for Brendan. Are you legally licensed to broker commercial loans, Mr. Kensington? Did you provide the mandatory federal disclosures required for such a transaction? Or did you just blindly hope the poor administrative assistant would not notice she was signing away her apartment to fund a failing tech startup? I could hear Kensington swallow hard over the speakerphone. The sound of his panic was palpable. "Listen," he mumbled, his voice suddenly stripped of its previous arrogance and replaced with raw fear. "I simply drafted the document based on the highly aggressive parameters requested by my client. I explicitly advised Beatrice that some of these clauses were unorthodox and potentially problematic if they were legally challenged in court." "You liar!" Beatrice screamed at the phone, her perfectly manicured facade crumbling as her face turned a deep shade of purple. "You told me it was completely bulletproof. It is bulletproof against someone who does not have adequate legal representation," I corrected her loudly. but against someone who actually knows the law, it is textbook malpractice. Mr. Kensington, if you do not want me to file a formal grievance first thing Monday morning for drafting a fraudulent financial instrument, I strongly suggest you advise your clients to revoke this document immediately. Beatrice Kensington said quickly, his voice shaking with undeniable panic. I have to go. I strongly advise you to withdraw the contract. Do not push this matter further. I will call you Monday. Wait. Do not hang up, Beatrice yelled. A loud beep echoed through the room. He had hung up. The powerful attorney they hired had run away in sheer terror. Beatrice sat frozen in absolute humiliation, her mouth hanging open. Brendan looked physically sick, gripping the edge of the glass table. They were completely and utterly exposed. The heavy silence in the dining room was broken only by the sound of Brendan swallowing hard. The dial tone from the disconnected call echoed in the air before Beatrice finally fumbled with her phone and turned it off. She refused to look at me. Her grand display of power had completely backfired, leaving her exposed as a fraud who bullied people with legal documents she did not even understand. But I was not finished. I had promised to expose the ultimate trap, and I was going to deliver. I picked up the thick stack of paper one last time. I flipped past the asset division, past the ridiculous lifestyle restrictions, and went straight to the very last page. It was a standalone addendum intentionally buried at the back, where a fatigued reader would simply glance over it and sign blindly. It was labeled simply as Schedule C, Financial Integration. You thought I would be so distracted by the humiliating grocery receipt clauses that I would not read the fine print at the very end, I said, looking directly into Brendan's terrified eyes. You thought the psychological pressure of this dinner would make me sign it just to stop the verbal abuse. But Schedule C is not a prenuptial clause at all. It is a commercial loan agreement disguised as a marital duty. Jamal frowned deeply, leaning forward across the table. A loan agreement? What do you mean, a loan agreement? I kept my eyes locked on my fiancé. I want Brendan to explain it. Go ahead, Brendan. Tell your brother-in-law exactly what you slipped into our marriage contract. Tell him how you plan to legally obligate your new wife to assume a $500,000 commercial debt. Brendan opened his mouth, but only a pathetic stammer came out. He looked exactly like a trapped animal caught in the headlights. It is just a formality, he whispered. A temporary bridge loan to help with the company cash flow. I slammed my hand flat against the document. A temporary bridge loan. Let me read the exact wording for the room. The secondary party, Madison Reed, agrees to act as the primary guarantor and sole collateral provider for a commercial line of credit in the amount of $500,000. The funds shall be deposited directly into the operating account of Brendan Cole Technology Startup. Furthermore, the secondary party agrees to leverage her primary residence and pristine personal credit score to secure said financing within 30 days of the marriage. Ashley gasped, her hands flying to her mouth in shock. Beatrice suddenly looked very interested in the crystal glasses, avoiding everyone's gaze. I looked at Brendan with absolute disgust. You thought I was a poor administrative assistant renting a cheap apartment downtown. But you also saw my perfect credit score when we applied for our shared credit card last year. You realized that my flawless financial history was the only thing standing between you and total bankruptcy. Your startup is bleeding cash. Your business credit is completely maxed out. No bank in the country will lend you another dime. So you decided to marry a woman you thought was naive and desperate just so you could force her to take out a massive loan under her own name, using her apartment lease as false collateral. It is not like that, Brendan pleaded, his voice cracking under the pressure. The company is on the verge of a massive breakthrough. We just need a little runway. The Series B funding will clear next week, and I would pay the loan right back before you even noticed. Do not insult my intelligence, I snapped sharply. If the business was actually thriving, you would not need your wife to secretly bankroll your daily operations using a predatory contract. You did not invite me here to welcome me into your family. You invited me here to harvest my credit score. You and your mother sat there calling me a gold digger, mocking my clothes and my job, all while you were actively trying to steal my financial future to save your own miserable skin." Jamal stood up from the table. His chair scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. He looked at Brendan with pure contempt. "You tried to trap her into a $500,000 debt without telling her. That is not just shady, Brendan. That is financial abuse." Beatrice finally snapped out of her humiliated stupor. "Sit down, Jamal," she yelled. "This is family business. Brendan is doing what it takes to build an empire. A good wife should be willing to support her husband's vision." "Support his vision?" I laughed, a sharp and bitter sound. "You mean fund his delusions? You act like you are protecting a massive fortune, Beatrice. But the truth is finally out. You are not trying to keep my hands out of your pockets. You are trying to force your hands into mine. You need my clean financial record to keep your pathetic illusion alive." Brendan looked down at his lap, utterly defeated. The grand illusion of the Cole family wealth had been shattered into a million pieces right over their Thanksgiving turkey. They were broke, desperate, and morally bankrupt. But they still had no idea just how massive of a mistake they had made by targeting me. I turned my full attention back to the man sitting across from me. For a moment, Brendan just stared at the tablecloth, his chest heaving as he tried to process the total collapse of his ambush. But then a subtle shift happened. The terrified boy vanished, replaced by the slick, silver-tongued salesman who had pitched his way into millions of dollars of venture capital debt. He sat up straight, adjusted his tailored cuffs, and adopted a deeply concerned, patronizing expression. Madison Brendan said, his voice dropping an octave to sound soothing and measured. "You are completely spiraling right now. I need you to take a deep breath and ground yourself. You are projecting a lot of past trauma onto a very standard financial arrangement." I stared at him, fascinated by the sheer audacity of his pivot. He was trying to gaslight me in front of his entire family. "Projecting trauma," I repeated flatly. "Yes," Brendan continued, leaning forward with a look of manufactured empathy. "We have talked about your avoidant attachment style before. You have severe trust issues when it comes to commitment. You always look for reasons to push people away when things get serious. You are viewing this legal contract as a trap because you are terrified of genuine vulnerability. I am not trying to steal from you. I am asking you to be my partner. I am asking you to invest in our shared future. You need to do the emotional work to overcome these defensive blocks." "You are asking me to mortgage my apartment to pay your corporate debts," I corrected him, keeping my tone deadpan. "It is not debt, it is leverage," Brendan argued smoothly, waving a hand in the air as if swatting away a fly. "You are fundamentally misunderstanding the tech space because you only see things from an administrative level. My company is incredibly profitable right now. We are experiencing unprecedented hypergrowth. We have a massive user base, and our quarterly revenue is completely off the charts. The only reason we need this temporary $500,000 bridge loan is because we are scaling so fast that our operational costs have temporarily outpaced our cash flow. It is a sign of overwhelming success." He looked around the table, gathering confidence as his mother nodded along in fierce agreement. Beatrice was desperate for him to spin this disaster into a victory. She shot me a smug look, clearly believing her son had just outsmarted the hysterical woman. "This is exactly how wealth is built," Brendan said, looking back at me with a condescending smile. "You leverage existing assets to create exponential returns. By putting your apartment up as collateral, you are proving that you believe in my vision. When the $10 million Series B funding from Apex Ventures clears next week, our valuation is going to skyrocket to $50 million. I will pay off the bridge loan immediately, and you will be the wife of a tech multimillionaire. But I need a partner who is fully committed, not someone who panics and cries financial abuse the second she sees a complex corporate document." He folded his arms across his chest, looking incredibly pleased with himself. He had used all the right buzzwords: hypergrowth, scaling, exponential returns. To someone who did not understand corporate finance, his speech probably sounded incredibly convincing. He had framed my legitimate outrage as emotional instability. He had painted himself as the visionary victim being held back by a paranoid, unsupportive partner who refused to do her part. Ashley chimed in perfectly on cue to support her brother. Honestly, Madison, you are embarrassing yourself. Brendan is offering you a golden ticket to a life you could never achieve on your own, and you are throwing a massive tantrum because you do not understand how venture capital works. You should be begging him for the opportunity to be part of his company instead of acting like a victim. Venture capital, I echoed, letting the words roll slowly off my tongue. The irony was so thick, it was practically choking me. Yes, venture capital, Brendan said sharply, losing a bit of his practiced patience. Apex Ventures is the most ruthless, selective firm in New York. They do not hand out $10 million checks to failing companies. They conducted months of rigorous due diligence. Their investment committee scrutinized every single aspect of my business model. They know my company is a gold mine. If my financials were truly as bad as you claim, do you really think the brilliant executives at Apex would be backing me right now? I looked at Brendan Cole, the man I had shared a bed with, the man who promised to protect me, and realized there was no integrity left in him. He was a hollow shell of buzzwords and borrowed money. You want to talk about due diligence? I asked, my voice deadly calm. Let us talk about your actual metrics, Brendan. Not the fabricated pitch deck you send to gullible angel investors, but your raw operational data. You claim you have a massive user base, but you are intentionally hiding a user churn rate of 82%. You are bleeding active accounts faster than you can acquire them. Your customer acquisition cost is currently triple the projected lifetime value of a single account. Your daily cash burn rate is astronomical. You have not paid your cloud hosting provider in 90 days, which means your servers are literally weeks away from being shut down entirely. Brendan's smug smile vanished so quickly, it was as if I had physically struck him across the face. The blood drained from his cheeks, leaving him looking sickly pale under the bright glow of the chandelier. How do you know that? He whispered, his voice trembling uncontrollably. That is highly confidential internal data. I ignored his pathetic question and pressed harder, refusing to give him a single second to formulate another lie. And what about your exponential returns? I continued, mocking his exact phrasing from earlier. Because from what I can see, the only thing growing exponentially in your life is your personal debt. You leased that Porsche Carrera under the company name to look successful to your friends, but you are 3 months behind on the payments. You maxed out 4 separate corporate credit cards just to maintain this pathetic illusion of immense wealth. Beatrice gripped the edge of the glass table, her knuckles turning stark white. What is she talking about, Brendan? She demanded, her voice shrill with sudden overwhelming panic. Tell her she is lying right now. Tell me your company is perfectly fine and that you are securing that funding. Brendan could not even look at his own mother. He stared blankly at his empty plate, his chest heaving with shallow, panicked breaths. Ashley was completely silent for the first time all evening, her eyes darting nervously between her brother and me. The grand, unshakable illusion of the Cole family wealth was shattering into tiny pieces right in front of them, and they had absolutely no idea how to stop it from happening. But I was not just going to destroy his professional facade. He had tried to steal my home and call it a marital duty. It was time to expose exactly where that stolen money was really going. You told your mother you needed my apartment as collateral to fund your critical business operations, I said, raising my voice so it echoed clearly off the high ceilings. But we both know that is a complete lie. You do not want my money to pay your software developers. You want my money to pay for the fitness model in Miami. Brendan flinched violently. His head snapped up, his eyes wide with absolute primal terror. Shut up, he hissed, glancing frantically at his mother and sister, as if he could somehow put the secret back into the box. But I was an unstoppable force now. Do not tell me to shut up. I fired back, my tone razor sharp. You told me you were flying to Silicon Valley for emergency board meetings the last 3 weekends in a row. But your platinum credit card statement tells a very different story. You dropped $15,000 on exclusive VIP tables at a South Beach nightclub. You spent $4,000 at a luxury oceanfront boutique buying designer handbags for a 22-year-old girl, while you brought me a cheap souvenir keychain and asked me to split our weekly grocery bill when you got back home. The dining room instantly exploded into absolute chaos. Beatrice gasped loudly, clutching her chest as if she were having a sudden heart attack. She violently knocked over her heavy crystal wine glass, sending a massive pool of dark red liquid soaking into the pristine white tablecloth. It looked exactly like blood spreading rapidly across the table. Ashley slammed her hands down hard, screaming at Brendan, asking him if it was true, and demanding to know how he could be so incredibly stupid to risk their entire reputation. Jamal let out a loud, frustrated groan, burying his face in his hands, clearly disgusted by the sheer magnitude of Brendan's betrayal and financial recklessness. Brendan jumped up from his dining chair, his face contorted in a wild mix of rage and desperate humiliation. He pointed a shaking finger at my face. "You have been spying on me," he yelled, his voice cracking loudly. "You hacked into my personal accounts. You are completely psychotic." "I did not hack anything, Brendan," I replied coldly, remaining perfectly and calmly seated while he completely lost his mind. "I simply pay attention to the financial details you are far too arrogant to hide properly. You thought you could easily manipulate me into funding your disgusting double life because you assumed I was too uneducated to understand a basic balance sheet. You brought me to this holiday dinner to slaughter me financially. But you forgot one crucial rule of business. Never try to con someone unless you know exactly who they are." For a split second, the only sound in the massive dining room was the rapid, shallow breathing of a family whose entire false reality had just been violently ripped apart. Brendan looked as though he might physically vomit right onto his untouched plate. But before he could even attempt to formulate another pathetic excuse, Beatrice completely lost whatever shred of aristocratic composure she had left. She pushed herself away from the table with such sudden violent force that her heavy wooden chair tipped backward and crashed loudly against the hardwood floor. The sudden noise echoed like a gunshot. "How dare you!" Beatrice shrieked. The veins in her neck were bulging against her heavily powdered skin, and her face contorted into a mask of pure fury. "You vicious, delusional little peasant! You sit at my table, drink my wine, and have the absolute audacity to invent these disgusting, slanderous lies about my son." She marched around the side of the table, her designer heels clicking sharply against the floor, stopping just a few feet away from my chair. She was practically vibrating with rage, pointing a perfectly manicured finger right at my face. "You are nothing," she spat, her voice echoing with venom. "You are an ungrateful, miserable girl who comes from absolute poverty. You wear cheap clothes, you work a pathetic little administrative job, and you are so insanely jealous of our success that you had to fabricate this ridiculous fantasy. You are sick in the head." I did not flinch. I did not lean away from her pointing finger. I just looked up at her with a steady stare that only seemed to infuriate her more. Brendan scrambled to his feet, holding his hands up in a frantic gesture. "Mom, stop," he pleaded. "Just sit down." But Beatrice was entirely deaf to reason. She shoved Brendan away, her eyes locked onto me with a terrifying intensity. "No, Brendan. I will not sit down," she yelled. "This gold digger thought she could come into my home and humiliate my family. She thought she could play games with us. Well, I am going to show you exactly what happens when you cross people of our stature." Beatrice leaned down, bringing her face inches from mine, her breath smelling of expensive red wine and bitter desperation. "Do you have any idea who I am?" she hissed. "Do you know who I play tennis with at the country club? I socialize with the most powerful executives in this city. I have board members on speed dial. I know the people who own the building where you sit in a tiny cubicle answering phones all day." She straightened up, crossing her arms over her chest with a look of supreme confidence. "By 9 o'clock on Monday morning, I am going to make one phone call." Beatrice threatened, her voice rising to a triumphant crescendo. "I am going to call the senior partners at your firm. I am going to tell them that you are unstable, that you steal confidential data, and that you are attempting to extort a prominent local family. I will have you fired from your pathetic little career before you even finish your morning coffee." Ashley, emboldened by her mother, nodded vigorously from across the table. "You are totally finished, Madison," Ashley chimed in, pointing her fork at me. "My mother is not joking. She got a woman fired from the country club last month just because the waitress spilled water on her shoes. You messed with the wrong family. You are going to be completely blacklisted from every corporate office in the entire state. You will be lucky if you can find a job flipping burgers when we are done with you." Beatrice smiled, a cold, predatory grimace that showed all her teeth. "That is right," she sneered. "I am going to crush you. I am going to make sure you are utterly unemployable. You are going to be evicted from your little rented apartment, and you will have absolutely no one to blame but yourself. You had the chance to be part of an empire, and instead you chose to be an enemy. I will destroy your entire life." I let her finish. I let her lay out every single threat, every petty insult, and every grandiose delusion of power she held in her head. I wanted her to feel completely and totally in control of the situation. I wanted her to believe with absolute certainty that she held my entire professional future in the palm of her hand. Because the higher she built her pedestal of absolute arrogance, the harder her ultimate fall was going to be. The stage was finally set perfectly for her complete destruction. She just handed me the match. Beatrice mistook my silence for submission. She watched me sitting perfectly still and wrongly assumed that her barrage of threats had finally broken my spirit. She took a deep, dramatic breath, smoothing the front of her expensive designer dress, as if physically brushing off the unpleasantness of my existence. Her posture shifted from aggressive hostility back to supreme, untouchable arrogance. A nasty, triumphant smile spread across her face as she looked down at me. "You really thought you could rattle us with some fabricated nonsense about credit cards?" Beatrice sneered, her voice echoing with renewed confidence. "You truly do not understand how the upper echelon of the business world operates. Powerful men like my son leverage debt to build empires. It is called strategic financing. But you would not know anything about that because you possess the mindset of a poor person. You are hyper-focusing on pennies while we are literally days away from securing millions." She walked slowly back to her chair at the head of the table but did not sit down. Instead, she placed her hands flat on the glass surface and leaned forward to deliver her ultimate trump card. In less than 1 week, Beatrice announced my son's company is closing a massive $10 million Series B funding round. And this is not just any standard funding round. The lead investor is Apex Ventures. She paused, clearly expecting me to gasp in awe at the prestigious name. When I simply blinked at her, she rolled her eyes in deep disgust at my apparent financial ignorance. "Of course you do not know who they are," Beatrice scoffed loudly. "Apex Ventures is the most ruthless, prestigious, and exclusive venture capital firm in New York. They manage billions of dollars in assets. They are notorious for rejecting 99% of the startups that pitch to them. They only invest in absolute unicorns. And they chose my son. Their top executives conducted a microscopic review of his entire business model and declared it a massive success. They are fully backing Brendan, which means his market valuation is about to explode overnight." Beatrice spread her arms wide, gesturing to the lavish dining room around us. "This house is just the beginning, Madison. By this time next year, we will be billionaires. Brendan will be featured on the cover of Forbes magazine. He will be ringing the opening bell at the stock exchange. We are going to buy a private estate in the Hamptons and a yacht to sail the Mediterranean. And you could have been part of it. You could have been the lucky little nobody who got dragged to the absolute top by marrying a visionary genius. All you had to do was sign a simple piece of paper and be a supportive, obedient wife." Brendan finally found his voice, but it was incredibly weak and strained. "Mom, please just stop talking about the funding," he pleaded, his eyes darting nervously toward me. He knew perfectly well that I had already exposed his fake internal metrics. He knew the ground beneath him was rapidly crumbling. "Nonsense." Brendan Beatrice snapped, completely misinterpreting his panic as modesty. You have absolutely no reason to be humble in front of this girl. She needs to understand exactly what she just threw away. She needs to know the sheer magnitude of the financial mistake she made today. When you are standing on the balcony of your new penthouse next year, I want her to be watching you from whatever miserable gutter she ends up in. Ashley clapped her hands together, a sharp, annoying sound that cut through the heavy tension. Exactly, Ashley chimed in eagerly. You blew it, Madison. Apex Ventures is going to make us richer than you can even comprehend. You played your stupid little games, and now you get to walk away with nothing while we ascend to the absolute top of the financial world. I sat there in silence, listening to them rave about Apex Ventures, and a profound sense of amusement washed over me. It took every ounce of professional restraint I possessed not to burst into hysterical laughter right then and there. Beatrice Cole was standing in her rented mansion, aggressively weaponizing my own company against me. She was using the venture capital firm that I personally operated as a club to beat me into submission. She was loudly bragging about a $10 million check that required my physical signature to actually clear. The irony was so rich and so incredibly potent that it almost felt like a scripted scene from a movie. They had built their entire fortress of arrogance around a single impending victory, completely unaware that the person holding the keys to the castle was sitting right across from their Thanksgiving turkey. While Beatrice basked in the imaginary glow of her future Hamptons estate, Jamal was experiencing a very different kind of revelation. He had remained completely silent during the escalating shouting match, sitting rigidly in his leather dining chair, with his eyes fixed on Brendan. Unlike his wife and mother-in-law, Jamal actually understood the corporate terminology I had just weaponized. He was a highly successful marketing director who spent his days analyzing the exact same performance metrics I had just thrown across the table. When I mentioned an 82% user churn rate and a customer acquisition cost that was triple the lifetime value, Beatrice and Ashley heard meaningless corporate jargon. But Jamal heard the unmistakable sound of a dying company. I watched Jamal carefully. I could practically see the gears turning in his head. He was doing the mental math, connecting the lavish spending habits of his brother-in-law with the catastrophic operational data I had just exposed. He looked at Brendan's trembling hands. He looked at the heavy sweat gathering on Brendan's forehead despite the cool air conditioning in the room. Then Jamal looked at the 50-page loan agreement masquerading as a prenuptial contract sitting right in front of me. The final puzzle piece snapped into place. Jamal realized I was telling the absolute truth. Jamal leaned forward, placing both of his hands flat on the glass table. Brendan, Jamal said, his deep voice cutting through the lingering echoes of Beatrice's gloating. Look at me. Brendan slowly raised his head, his eyes wide and terrified like a trapped animal. Beatrice immediately stopped her victorious pacing and shot Jamal a warning glare, clearly irritated that he was interrupting her moment of triumph. Are those numbers real, Brendan? Jamal asked calmly, though the underlying tension in his voice was unmistakable. Do not lie to me. Is your churn rate actually above 80%? Are you really 3 months behind on your server payments? Brendan opened his mouth to speak, but he just swallowed hard and looked away. That silence was all the confirmation Jamal needed. Jamal let out a heavy breath, shaking his head in absolute disbelief. You idiot, Jamal muttered, running a hand over his face. You absolute arrogant idiot. You are not experiencing hyper-growth. You are hemorrhaging cash and trying to plug the holes with credit cards. Excuse me, Beatrice snapped loudly, stepping toward Jamal with her hands on her hips. Do not speak to my son that way. You heard me say that Apex Ventures is about to give him $10 million. He is a visionary. He is a fraud. Beatrice Jamal fired back, his voice rising in volume as his patience finally evaporated completely. He turned his attention fully to his mother-in-law, no longer bothering to maintain his polite diplomatic facade. Do you not understand what is actually happening right now? If Brendan is falsifying his operational metrics to secure venture capital funding, he is not building an empire. He is committing a massive federal crime. Ashley gasped loudly from across the table. Jamal, she scolded him sharply. Stop being so dramatic. Everyone stretches the truth a little bit in business. It is called marketing. It is called wire fraud. Ashley, Jamal yelled, slamming his hand on the table so hard the silverware rattled. You cannot fake a user base to steal $10 million from an institutional investor. Apex Ventures is not some local bank you can sweet-talk into a personal loan. They are a multi-billion-dollar financial institution with an army of forensic accountants and lawyers. When they conduct their final audit before releasing those funds and discover that Brendan cooked the books, they will not just cancel the deal. They will hand his hard drives over to the FBI. The color drained completely from Beatrice's face. The terrifying reality of the situation was finally piercing through her thick layer of delusion. She looked at Brendan desperately, hoping he would deny Jamal's accusations. Tell him he is wrong. Brendan, Beatrice pleaded, her voice shaking with genuine fear for the first time all evening. Tell him your numbers are real. Brendan just sat there completely paralyzed by his own impending destruction. He could not look at his mother. He could not look at Jamal. He just stared blankly at his spilled wine. Jamal pushed his chair back and stood up, looking down at his brother-in-law with pure, unfiltered disgust. You were actually going to let Madison leverage her apartment to cover your tracks, Jamal said, his voice laced with venom. You were going to drag her down into a federal indictment just to buy yourself a few more months of fake success. I just never realized you were a complete and total sociopath. The echo of Jamal's accusation hung in the air like a physical weight. Sociopath. The word seemed to bounce off the crystal chandelier and shatter whatever fragile piece remained in the room. But instead of turning her horror toward her son, Beatrice whipped her head toward Jamal. Her eyes narrowed into tiny, vicious slits. She did not care about the federal wire fraud or the fake user metrics. The only crime she cared about was Jamal daring to challenge the false supremacy of her family. How dare you speak to my son with such blatant disrespect? Beatrice hissed, stepping entirely away from Brendan and advancing toward Jamal. You are completely out of line. You have absolutely no right to sit at my table and accuse a Cole of being a criminal. You are an outsider. You always have been. Jamal stared at his mother-in-law, his expression hardening into a mask of pure disbelief. An outsider? He repeated slowly, his voice tight. I am your son-in-law. I have been married to your daughter for 5 years. I have paid for every single luxury she flaunts. And I am trying to stop Brendan from going to federal prison. You are trying to ruin him because you are jealous, Ashley shrieked, jumping up from her chair to stand beside her mother. She pointed her manicured finger directly at her husband's chest. Do not act like you are trying to save us. You are just threatened by his success. You have always resented the fact that Brendan is building a legacy while you just work for someone else. Jamal looked at his wife as if he were seeing a total stranger. Ashley, he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous octave. Your brother is literally forging financial documents to steal $10 million. He tried to force Madison to mortgage her apartment to cover his tracks. Do you even hear yourself right now? I hear a man who forgot exactly where he came from. Beatrice snapped, her voice dripping with venomous condescension. Let us be very clear about your position in this family, Jamal. You were a nobody before you married my daughter. You grew up in a tiny, pathetic house on the wrong side of the city. We elevated you. We brought you into our country club. We introduced you to the right people. We gave you the social polish you desperately needed. You owe everything you have to the Cole family name. And instead of showing a single ounce of gratitude, you side with this crazy little administrative assistant. The blatant racism and classism in her words were not even thinly veiled anymore. She was weaponizing his background, completely ignoring the fact that Jamal had earned 2 master's degrees and climbed to the top of his corporate ladder entirely on his own merit, long before he ever met Ashley. She genuinely believed that her white upper-middle-class approval was the only reason a brilliant African-American man had achieved anything in his life. Ashley crossed her arms, standing shoulder to shoulder with her mother. She did not defend him. She did not correct Beatrice. Instead, she doubled down. You need to sit down right now, Jamal. Ashley demanded, her tone sounding exactly like her mother's. You are embarrassing me. You need to stop making a scene, apologize to my brother, and support this family. We protect our own. We protect blood. You either stand with us or you can leave. Jamal did not scream. He did not throw a tantrum or knock over his wine glass. He simply stood there, absorbing the absolute toxicity radiating from the women standing in front of him. The scales finally fell completely from his eyes. He saw the ugly, rotten core of the family he had sacrificed so much to please. He looked at Ashley, taking in her furious, entitled expression, and realized there was absolutely nothing left to salvage. He had spent 5 years trying to prove he was worthy of a seat at their table, only to realize the table was built on lies, fraud, and deep-seated prejudice. Jamal slowly unbuttoned his tailored suit jacket. He took one deliberate step backward, physically distancing himself from the table, from Ashley, and from the entire Cole family. He did not sit back down as he was ordered. He stood tall, his posture radiating a quiet, formidable strength. I do not owe you anything, Beatrice, Jamal said, his voice deathly calm and perfectly clear. And Ashley, if supporting this family means blindly cheering for a felon while he destroys innocent people to fund your designer handbag collection, then you are absolutely right. I am an outsider. He took another step back, effectively crossing an invisible boundary in the room forever. Jamal turning his back on the family was the final catalyst Brendan needed to completely abandon whatever pathetic remnants of a moral compass he still possessed. With Jamal stepping away, Brendan was left standing entirely exposed, surrounded only by the toxic echo chamber of his mother and sister. They had spent his entire life inflating his ego and shielding him from the consequences of his actions. And now they were wordlessly demanding that he crush me to protect their collective delusion. He looked at Jamal, his face flushing a deep, angry red, before turning his attention entirely back to me. Brendan planted his hands firmly on the table and slowly stood up, pushing his chair back. He straightened his shoulders, trying to project an air of absolute dominance, though the slight tremble in his fingers betrayed his profound panic. He looked down at me, his eyes devoid of the warmth I had once believed was genuine. You are not leaving this table until you fix this, Madison Brendan commanded, his voice cold and terrifyingly flat. You think you are so incredibly smart because you read a few financial documents. You think you can just come into my mother's home, insult my family, tear apart my business model, and walk away clean. That is not how the world works. He reached across the table, grabbed the thick prenuptial agreement, and shoved it back toward my plate. The heavy document slid across the glass, stopping just inches from my chest. You are going to sign this contract right now, Brendan stated, pointing a rigid finger down at the paper. You are going to sign it, and tomorrow morning you are going to leverage your apartment to secure that $500,000 loan. We are going to use that money to stabilize my servers and pay down my customer acquisition costs. When the $10 million from Apex Ventures clears next week, I will pay off your stupid loan and you will get to be the wife of a major tech CEO. I looked at him, absolutely amazed by his sheer inability to grasp reality. Brendan, I said softly, almost whispering, you just committed wire fraud. You lied to institutional investors. You cannot fix that with a $500,000 Band-Aid. Shut up, Brendan yelled, slamming his hand flat onto the contract. I do not care what you think. I do not care about your pathetic administrative opinions on corporate finance. I am the visionary. I am the CEO. You are just the collateral I need to cross the finish line. He stepped away from the table, walked around to my side, and stood towering over me. He pointed a finger directly toward the grand double doors at the front of the mansion. This is your final ultimatum, Madison. Brendan sneered, his face mere inches from mine. You have two choices. You can pick up that pen, sign your name, and prove that you are actually committed to building our empire. If you do that, I will forgive your hysterical outburst tonight. We will get married and I will elevate you out of that miserable, pathetic life you live downtown. He paused, letting his threat hang heavily in the silent dining room. His mother and sister watched eagerly, waiting for the devastating blow. But if you refuse, Brendan continued, his voice dropping to a vicious whisper. If you refuse to support me right now when I need it most, then this relationship is completely over. The wedding is off. I will cancel the venue tomorrow. You can stand up right now, walk out that front door, and go straight back to being a broke invisible secretary. You will never set foot in a house like this again. You will never experience real wealth. You will spend the rest of your miserable life regretting the moment you walked away from Brendan Cole. His words were designed to obliterate my self-esteem. They were designed to terrify a poor woman who desperately needed his financial security. He truly believed that the threat of losing him, of losing access to his imaginary wealth, would force me to surrender my autonomy and sign away my financial future. I slowly turned my head and looked at Beatrice and Ashley. They were both smiling. It was a cold, satisfied expression. They believed Brendan had finally asserted his dominance. They thought they had won. I looked back at Brendan, taking in his arrogant stance, his expensive suit, and the absolute lack of love in his eyes. He had drawn his line in the sand. He had reduced our entire relationship, our supposed love, to a simple financial transaction. I let out a slow, deliberate breath. I reached out and gently picked up the silver pen Brendan had offered me earlier. I held it between my fingers, feeling the smooth metal. You are absolutely right, Brendan, I said quietly, my voice perfectly calm. This relationship is completely over. But I am not the one who is going to be walking back to a miserable poor life tonight. I slowly let go of the cheap silver pen Brendan had offered me. It clattered softly against the glass table, rolling away until it bumped into his wine glass. The room remained suffocatingly silent as everyone watched my next move. They expected me to burst into tears. They expected me to grab my coat and run out the front door in a flurry of humiliation. Instead, I reached down to the floor beside my chair and picked up my purse. It was a faded canvas tote bag, the kind you get for free at a generic corporate conference. I had specifically chosen it for this dinner to complete my pathetic administrative assistant costume. Beatrice let out a harsh scoff, clearly assuming I was simply gathering my belongings to flee the mansion as ordered. But I was not leaving. Not yet. I unzipped the main compartment of the canvas tote. My hand bypassed the inexpensive lip balm and generic mints, reaching into the hidden velvet-lined security pocket sewn deep into the lining. My fingers closed around the heavy, familiar metal cylinder. I slowly pulled my hand out and placed the object directly into the center of the illuminated dining table, right on top of their ridiculous 50-page contract. The object hit the thick paper with a solid thud that resonated through the room. It was a custom limited edition Mont Blanc fountain pen. It was crafted from solid platinum, deeply engraved with intricate geometric patterns, and encrusted with a single flawless sapphire at the top of the cap. It was a masterpiece of European craftsmanship that retailed for exactly $5,000. It was a gift I had received from a highly satisfied billionaire client after I successfully negotiated a massive corporate merger the previous year. The pen gleamed brilliantly under the crystal chandelier, radiating an aura of undeniable wealth. It looked completely alien sitting next to my frayed sweater and faded canvas bag. For a moment, nobody moved. The Cole family stared at the pen as if I had just placed a live explosive device on their dinner table. Beatrice, a woman who dedicated her entire life to worshiping luxury brands and studying wealth markers, immediately recognized the iconic star emblem on the cap. Her arrogant sneer instantly vanished, replaced by a look of profound, short-circuiting confusion. She blinked rapidly, her eyes darting frantically between my cheap thrift store clothes and the breathtakingly expensive writing instrument sitting inches from her hands. Ashley leaned so far forward over the table that her diamond bracelet clinked against her porcelain plate. "Is that?" Ashley started to ask, her voice suddenly breathless and completely stripped of its previous mockery. "Is that a real Mont Blanc?" Brendan just stood there, frozen, his mouth hanging slightly open. His brain was desperately trying to process the visual contradiction in front of him. He knew exactly what an administrative assistant's salary looked like, and he knew perfectly well that a woman living paycheck to paycheck could not afford a pen that cost more than a used car. I did not answer Ashley. I did not offer any explanations. I reached out and picked up the heavy platinum pen. The cool metal felt perfectly balanced in my hand, a familiar tool of my actual trade. With a smooth, practiced motion, I twisted the cap off, exposing the gleaming gold nib. I looked up at Brendan, holding his panicked gaze. Then, with absolute, unwavering authority, I pressed the nib of the $5,000 pen directly onto the front page of his meticulously drafted prenuptial agreement. I did not sign my name. I pressed down hard, letting the dark, permanent ink flow heavily onto the thick paper, and drew a massive, aggressive X straight across the entire cover sheet. The line was so thick and the pressure so intense that I could feel the sharp nib tearing slightly into the paper fibers beneath it. I drew a second line, intersecting the first, completely defacing the legal document they had spent weeks planning to use against me. The dark ink bled through to the second page, destroying their pathetic attempt at financial extortion. "What are you doing?" Brendan gasped, finally snapping out of his paralyzed state. He lunged forward as if to save the document, but it was already ruined. "I am rejecting your terrible business proposal, Brendan," I said, my voice projecting a commanding corporate chill that he had never heard from me before. "You brought a cheap trick to a high-stakes negotiation. You assumed I was an easy target because of the clothes I wear. But your mother was right about one thing. People like you and people like me operate on completely different financial levels. You are just mistaken about who is standing at the top." I left the ruined document on the table and reached back into my canvas bag. I pulled out a device they had never seen before. It was not the cheap, outdated smartphone I carried around them to maintain my administrative assistant persona. It was a heavy matte black corporate device. It was fully encrypted, completely secure, and strictly issued only to top-level executives who handled multi-million-dollar transactions on a daily basis. Beatrice stared at the device, her eyes darting from the ruined contract to the heavy phone. You could practically see the gears jamming in her head as her rigid worldview completely collapsed. Ashley was gripping the edge of the table, her knuckles white, her mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. Brendan looked like he was about to pass out. He had built his entire identity on projecting wealth, and right now he was watching the woman he thought was a broke secretary dismantle his reality piece by piece. I unlocked the device with a biometric scan. The screen illuminated my face in the dim light of the dining room. I navigated to my private contacts list, selected a specific number, and tapped the speakerphone icon. I placed the phone gently onto the glass table right next to the massive ink stain I had just created. The phone began to ring. The sound was loud and crisp, echoing through the suffocating silence of the room. One ring, two rings. "What are you doing?" Beatrice finally managed to croak out, her voice stripped of all its previous aristocratic authority. "Who are you calling? Have you lost your mind?" I did not even look at her. I just watched the call timer connect. "Good evening, Miss Reed," a highly professional male voice answered through the speaker. "I apologize if there is any background noise. We are currently finalizing the transition protocols for the recent acquisition. How can I assist you tonight?" The voice belonged to Richard Montgomery. He was the Senior Operations Director for Pinnacle Property Management. Pinnacle was the exclusive firm that managed the ultra-luxury gated community where the Cole family currently resided. It was a sprawling neighborhood of massive estates, private tennis courts, and heavy iron security gates. "Good evening, Richard," I replied smoothly, leaning back in my chair. "I am sorry to bother you on a holiday, but I need to initiate an immediate administrative action regarding one of the residential parcels." "It is absolutely no bother, Miss Reed," Richard said immediately, his tone dripping with extreme deference. "You are the priority. Which parcel are we discussing?" Beatrice gasped. She recognized Richard's voice. Every resident in the community knew Richard. He was the man who enforced the strict neighborhood guidelines, approved architectural changes, and managed the incredibly high monthly association fees. Beatrice regularly called his office to complain about her neighbor's landscaping or to demand extra security patrols. Hearing him speak to me with the kind of profound respect usually reserved for a boss sent a visible tremor down her spine. "I am currently sitting at 4200 Oakwood Drive," I said, reading off the exact address of the Cole family mansion. "I need you to pull up the active residential lease agreement for this specific property." Brendan shot up from his chair. "Madison, hang up the phone right now," he hissed, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. "You have no idea what you are doing. This is a private residence." Beatrice took a hesitant step forward, her manicured hands trembling visibly at her sides. She opened her mouth to order Richard to disconnect the call, but her voice completely failed her. The sheer confidence I displayed, the brutal destruction of the contract, and the effortless way I commanded the senior director of her exclusive community had finally broken through her thick wall of denial. She realized she was not dealing with a victim. She was standing in the path of a rapidly approaching storm, and she had absolutely no shelter. Brendan was breathing heavily, sweat beading on his forehead as he stared at the encrypted device on the table. He knew I was executing a calculated strike, but he had no idea what the target was. Richard Fste continued, completely ignoring Brendan. Pathetic outburst. "Could you please confirm the current status of 4200 Oakwood Drive for the people sitting in the room with me?" "Certainly, Miss Reed," Richard replied, the sound of rapid typing echoing through the speaker. "Pulling up the master file now." The property located at 4200 Oakwood Drive was formerly owned by a private real estate trust. However, as of Tuesday morning, the deed was officially transferred to a new entity, entirely pending your final authorized signature for the public record. The silence following his confirmation was absolute. Beatrice stopped breathing. Her perfectly manicured hands gripped the edge of the dining table so hard her knuckles turned stark white. She stared at the encrypted smartphone as if it were a venomous snake about to strike. Brendan stumbled backward, his legs hitting the edge of a mahogany sideboard. He grabbed the polished wood to keep himself from collapsing completely onto the floor. The lavish holiday atmosphere, the crystal glasses, the massive roasted turkey, all of it suddenly felt like a ridiculous stage play that had just been violently cancelled. "Thank you, Richard," I said, keeping my voice level. "Could you please state the name of the new entity taking ownership of the Oakwood subdivision?" "Certainly, Miss Reed," Richard replied promptly. "The entire community, including all 92 residential parcels, the private country club, and the 18-hole golf course, was purchased by Vanguard Holdings LLC in a cash transaction." I looked up and locked my eyes with Beatrice. Her face was drained of blood. She looked like a ghost haunting her own dinner party. "Vanguard Holdings." I repeated slowly, letting the names sink deep into their panicked minds. "That is my private real estate portfolio, Beatrice. I am Vanguard Holdings. I bought this entire neighborhood on Tuesday morning." Ashley let out a sharp, hysterical gasp. "That is impossible," she shrieked, her voice cracking under the sheer weight of her panic. "You cannot buy this neighborhood. We own this house. My mother owns this house outright." I turned to Ashley, offering her a smile so cold it could have frozen boiling water. "You do not own anything, Ashley. Your mother has not owned a single piece of real estate in over 10 years. Did you really think I did not run a full financial background check on this entire family before I agreed to marry your brother? Your parents sold this house to a private trust a decade ago to cover massive stock market losses. You have been leasing it back ever since, paying an exorbitant monthly rent just to maintain the pathetic illusion of generational wealth. And as of Tuesday, you are officially renting it from me." Beatrice let out a low moan, finally sinking heavily into her leather chair. Her grand illusion was shattered. She was not the untouchable queen of Oakwood Drive. She was a tenant at the absolute mercy of the woman she had just spent the last hour relentlessly humiliating. All her bragging about country clubs and high society connections meant absolutely nothing. "Richard," I said into the phone, ignoring the whimpering woman at the head of the table, I need to initiate an immediate change in the lease terms for the current occupants at 4200 Oakwood Drive. Please access their residential file. I have it right here, Miss Reed, Richard confirmed efficiently. How would you like to proceed with this property? According to their current lease agreement, they are operating on a month-to-month basis. I stated, reciting the exact facts I had memorized earlier that week. Effective immediately, I am authorizing a 50% increase in their monthly rent. Please generate the new invoice and have it delivered by courier tomorrow morning. Understood, Richard replied without hesitation. I will process the 50% rent increase immediately. Is there anything else you require tonight? Yes, I said, my voice slicing through the heavy, suffocating air of the dining room. Draft a 30-day notice to vacate the premises. Have it printed, officially notarized, and posted directly to their front door by tomorrow afternoon. They have exactly 30 days to pack up their fake old money aesthetic and find a new place to live. No! Beatrice screamed suddenly, lunging forward across the long table. Her hand scrambled frantically toward the phone, knocking over a silver gravy boat and sending a wave of thick brown liquid splashing onto the ruined contract. You cannot do this. We have lived here for 20 years. This is my home. You cannot evict me like a common criminal. I smoothly pulled the phone out of her reach. Actually, Beatrice, I can... I replied, staring at her tear-streaked face. As the legal owner of this property, I have the absolute right to terminate any month-to-month lease without citing a specific cause. However, if you would prefer, I can formally cite the hostile environment and the attempted financial extortion that occurred on these premises tonight. Brendan covered his face with his hands, letting out a pathetic, muffled sob. The grand CEO, the visionary tech mogul, was crying like a helpless child. He realized his company was dead, his mother was being thrown out, and it was entirely his fault. He brought the executioner inside and handed her the axe. The pathetic sound of Brendan sobbing was suddenly drowned out by a piercing, hysterical scream from across the table. Ashley had finally snapped out of her paralyzed state, and her brain instantly defaulted to the only defense mechanism she had left: absolute, aggressive denial. She slammed both of her hands flat onto the glass table, her diamond bracelets clattering violently against the hard surface. "It is a bluff!" Ashley shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly off the dining room walls. "She is lying. Do not listen to her, Mom. This is all a giant, pathetic bluff." Ashley turned frantically toward her mother, grabbing Beatrice by the shoulder and shaking her slightly as if trying to wake her from a nightmare. "Think about it, Mom." Ashley pleaded, her eyes wide and manic. "Look at her clothes. Look at her cheap shoes. A woman who owns a multi-million-dollar real estate portfolio does not dress like she shops at a discount rack. She does not carry a frayed canvas bag. She is just a secretary. She probably hired some out-of-work actor to pretend to be a property manager on the phone. It is a prank. She is trying to scare us because she is furious that we asked her to sign the prenuptial agreement." Beatrice looked up, a tiny, desperate flicker of hope igniting in her tear-filled eyes. She desperately wanted to believe her daughter. She wanted to believe that her lavish lifestyle was still completely safe, that she was still the queen of her suburban castle. She looked at the encrypted phone sitting on the table, then up at me, her expression wavering between paralyzing fear and a sudden desperate anger. "You set this whole thing up," Ashley accused, pointing a shaking manicured finger directly at my face. "You are sick and twisted, Madison. You knew you could never fit into our world, so you orchestrated this entire theatrical performance to humiliate us. But it is not going to work. We are going to call the real property management office on Monday morning, and they are going to tell us that we still have our lease. You do not own anything. You are just a pathetic liar who wants to feel important for 5 minutes." I did not interrupt her. I sat perfectly still in my chair, allowing her to exhaust her frantic energy. It was fascinating to watch the human ego fight so violently against undeniable reality. Ashley was so deeply conditioned to judge a person's entire worth by their outward appearance, by designer logos and expensive fabrics, that she simply could not comprehend the concept of stealth wealth. She needed tangible, irrefutable proof. Words and phone calls were no longer enough to pierce through her thick layer of delusion. She needed something she could see, something she could understand in her shallow, materialistic vocabulary. "I am not going to argue with you, Ashley," I said quietly, my voice calm and perfectly measured against her hysterical screaming. "But I will give you the visual confirmation you so desperately need." I reached my hand back into the deep velvet-lined security pocket of my faded canvas tote bag. My fingers bypassed the expensive fountain pen I had already used to destroy their contract. Instead, I pulled out a sleek, minimalist black leather card holder. It was completely devoid of any flashy designer logos, exactly the kind of accessory Ashley would normally mock for looking cheap. I opened the leather fold. I did not pull out a standard plastic bank card or a common gold credit card. I slid my index finger against the cold, heavy metal of the most exclusive financial instrument in the world. I extracted the American Express Centurion Black Card. It was forged from solid titanium. It was noticeably heavier than any standard piece of plastic, carrying a physical weight that perfectly matched its financial power. It was an invitation-only card issued strictly to the global elite, requiring an immense net worth and an astronomical annual spending history just to qualify. It was the ultimate status symbol, a piece of metal that opened any door, chartered any private jet, and possessed absolutely no spending limit. I held the heavy black metal card between my thumb and forefinger for a brief second, ensuring that the light from the massive crystal chandelier above us caught its distinct metallic sheen. Then, with a flick of my wrist, I tossed it onto the glass dining table. The card landed right next to the ruined prenuptial agreement. It did not make the soft, dull tapping sound of cheap plastic. It hit the thick glass surface with a sharp, heavy, undeniable metallic clink. That sound echoed loudly through the dining room. The solid titanium instantly silenced Ashley and her pathetic screams. Every pair of eyes at the table was glued to the small black rectangle resting on the glass. The polished titanium reflected the warm glow of the chandelier, looking completely out of place next to the spilled wine and the ruined legal document. Ashley opened her mouth to speak, likely to accuse me of buying a fake prop online, but Jamal beat her to it. He slowly walked back toward the table, completely ignoring the invisible boundary he had drawn just moments ago. He did not look at his wife or his mother-in-law. His gaze was locked entirely on the metal card. As a marketing director who handled high-profile corporate accounts, Jamal spent his life analyzing wealth indicators. He knew the difference between newly acquired flashy money and the kind of deep institutional wealth that moved markets. He stopped right beside Brendan's chair and leaned over the table, staring at the card as if he were looking at a ghost. "That is a centurion," Jamal whispered, his voice stripped of all its previous anger, replaced by a tone of absolute staggering awe. He slowly raised his head and looked directly at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of profound shock and immense respect. "You are holding a real centurion card." Ashley frowned, her manicured fingers nervously playing with her diamond bracelet. "What does that even mean, Jamal?" she demanded, her voice trembling slightly. "It is just a black credit card. Anyone can get a black card if they pay the annual fee." Jamal let out a harsh, humorless laugh. He turned to look at his wife, shaking his head in sheer disbelief at her ignorance. "No, Ashley," he said, his voice ringing with absolute certainty. "Anyone cannot just get that card. You cannot apply for it. You cannot ask for it. American Express has to personally invite you to carry it. And they only extend that invitation to a fraction of the top 1% of the global population." Jamal turned his attention to Beatrice and Brendan, ensuring they understood exactly what kind of monster they had just tried to lock in a cage. "To even be considered for that piece of metal," Jamal explained, speaking slowly, so every single word sank deep into their terrified minds. "You have to actually spend and pay off at least $250,000 a year across your other accounts. But that is just the baseline. The real requirement, the hidden metric that keeps people like us from ever touching one, is the asset verification. You need a verified liquid net worth of at least $50 million. He pointed a shaking finger at the card. That is not a credit card. That is a global financial weapon. Jamal looked back at Brendan, whose face had gone completely slack. She is not an administrative assistant, Brendan, Jamal stated, delivering the final crushing blow. You do not get a Centurion card by filing paperwork. You get it by owning the building where the paperwork is filed. The blood drained completely from Brendan's face, leaving his skin a sickly, translucent shade of gray. His knees finally buckled, and he collapsed heavily back into his dining chair, staring blankly at the titanium card. The arrogant tech chief executive officer was entirely gone, replaced by a terrified boy who had just realized he brought a knife to a nuclear war. Beatrice looked as though she had been physically struck. Her chest heaved with shallow, panicked breaths. She looked from the card to Jamal and finally to me. The sheer magnitude of her mistake was crashing down on her in massive, suffocating waves. She had spent the entire evening mocking my thrift store clothes, calling me a gold digger, and threatening to use her pathetic country club connections to destroy my career. She had tried to forcefully evict a woman who possessed a verified net worth of over $50 million. Beatrice finally understood that the phone call to the property management firm was not a theatrical bluff. The woman sitting across from her truly was Vanguard Holdings. The woman she had treated like a worthless peasant actually owned the very ground she was standing on. Ashley clamped both hands over her mouth, tears of pure terror welling up in her eyes. The grand, unshakable delusion of the Cole family had been entirely dismantled, stripped down to its rotting foundation, and exposed for the pathetic fraud it always was. They had spent their entire lives worshiping money and projecting a false image of supremacy to the outside world. Yet when finally faced with reality, they were far too blinded by their own immense arrogance to recognize true wealth when it was sitting right in front of them at their own Thanksgiving table. Beatrice began to hyperventilate. The sound of her rapid, ragged breathing filled the dining room, a sharp contrast to the absolute silence that had just fallen over the rest of the table. She clutched the fabric of her expensive designer dress right over her chest, her knuckles turning a stark shade of white. She looked like a woman who had just been forcefully shoved out of an airplane without a parachute. Her eyes darted wildly around the room, landing on the heavy titanium card, then on Jamal, then on Brendan, and finally settling on me. But the human ego is an incredibly resilient and dangerous thing. Instead of accepting defeat, Beatrice dug her perfectly manicured nails into the edge of the glass table and forced herself to stand up. Her legs were visibly shaking, and her knees knocked against the heavy wooden frame of her chair, but she refused to remain seated in the presence of someone who had just asserted total dominance over her life. She took a deep, shuddering breath, forcing oxygen into her panic-stricken lungs. Her face, previously drained of all color, suddenly flushed with an unhealthy, blotchy red. She was desperately searching her mind for a weapon, a shield, any possible lifeline that could save her from this profound humiliation. And in her state of absolute desperation, her brain latched onto the only grand illusion that had not yet been completely dismantled right in front of her. The tech startup. She pointed a trembling finger at me, her mouth twisting into a grotesque sneer that completely ruined her carefully maintained aristocratic features. "Fine," Beatrice screamed, her voice cracking violently under the immense strain. "Keep your money. Keep your stupid black card and your real estate portfolio. We do not want a single dime of your wealth anyway. You can evict us from this house if it makes you feel powerful, but you are not going to win this war, Madison." Beatrice slammed her hands down on the table, leaning forward with a look of pure, unhinged defiance. "You think $50 million makes you a god?" she shouted, the volume of her voice rattling the crystal glasses. "You think you can just come into my family and crush us? But you are completely forgetting one crucial detail. My son is a visionary genius. You might have money now, but Brendan is about to eclipse your entire net worth in a matter of months. We do not need your apartment for collateral. We do not need your pathetic bridge loan. Next week, the $10 million Series B funding from Apex Ventures is going to officially clear his corporate accounts. Once that institutional money hits his bank, his company valuation is going to absolutely skyrocket. He is going to be worth hundreds of millions of dollars. He is going to buy a mansion 10 times the size of this one in cash, and he will not let you anywhere near the front gate. Ashley, hearing her mother's fierce counterattack, immediately latched onto the false hope. She wiped the tears from her heavily made-up eyes and sat up straight, nodding vigorously. "Exactly," Ashley chimed in, her voice regaining a fraction of its previous arrogant edge. "Brendan is backed by the most powerful venture capital firm in the country. Apex does not make mistakes. They spent 6 months conducting rigorous financial audits on his software platform. Their top investment committee practically begged him to take their money. They know he is building the next global tech monopoly. By the time the ink dries on those term sheets next week, your little real estate company will look like a joke compared to his empire. You are going to regret tearing up that prenuptial agreement, Madison. When Brendan rings the bell at the stock exchange, you will be nothing but a bitter, forgotten footnote in his biography." Brendan, however, was not joining in their triumphant chorus. He was frantically shaking his head, his hands gripping his hair in a gesture of absolute despair. "Mom, Ashley, shut up," Brendan begged, his voice barely a hoarse whisper. "Please just stop talking about Apex." Beatrice was entirely deaf to his pleas. She was riding a massive wave of adrenaline and delusion, firmly believing she had found the perfect counterstrike to my titanium card. She looked at me with supreme misplaced victory. "Apex Ventures is going to make us untouchable," Beatrice declared proudly, tilting her chin up. "So go ahead and take your fancy pen and your black card and get out of my dining room. We do not need you. Apex is going to give my son everything he deserves." I sat perfectly still, listening to her praise my own company, watching her build her final fortress on a foundation I completely controlled. I let out a laugh. It was not a chuckle or a scoff, but a cold, terrifying laugh that echoed loudly across the ruined dining table. The sound of my genuine amusement completely stopped Beatrice in her tracks. Her aggressive posture faltered, and she stared at me as if I had suddenly grown a second head. I placed my elbows gently on the glass surface and rested my chin on my folded hands, completely unbothered by her desperate threats. "Oh, Beatrice," I said softly, a dark smile playing on my lips. "You are so fiercely protective of a castle that is already burning to the ground. You want to talk about the rigorous financial audits Apex Ventures conducted on your son. Let us talk about them. Let us talk about the specific findings of the investment committee." I turned my attention away from the delusional mother and locked eyes entirely with the terrified son. Brendan sat frozen in his chair, his skin pale and slick with nervous sweat. "Brendan," I began, my voice perfectly clear and razor-sharp, "your total operating expenses for the last quarter were exactly $2.4 million. Meanwhile, your actual generated revenue, excluding the artificial influx from your personal credit cards, was a pathetic $312,000. You are currently operating at a net negative margin of 869%. Beatrice opened her mouth to interrupt, likely to accuse me of making up random numbers, but the sheer panic radiating from Brendan silenced her. He was gripping the armrests of his chair so tightly, his knuckles were white. "How do you know that?" Brendan whispered, his voice trembling violently. "Those numbers are strictly confidential. They are only in the sealed financial disclosures I sent to the Apex Review Board." I ignored his question and continued my systematic dismantling of his precious company. Furthermore, I stated, reciting the data flawlessly from memory, "Your server infrastructure is completely outdated and severely compromised. You have 3 pending lawsuits from former employees claiming unpaid wages, which you deliberately omitted from your initial pitch deck. And most importantly, your core proprietary algorithm, the singular piece of technology you claimed would revolutionize the market, was actually built using open-source code. You do not even own the intellectual property you are trying to sell to institutional investors. You are pitching a stolen product." Ashley let out a small, terrified gasp. Brendan looked as though he were going to be physically sick right there at the table. He was paralyzed with absolute primal fear. He stared at me, his eyes wide and unblinking. The realization was slowly beginning to dawn on him, but his brain was violently rejecting the impossible truth. He could not comprehend how the quiet administrative assistant he thought he was manipulating possessed the exact, highly classified internal data of his failing startup. "You hacked my servers!" Brendan suddenly accused, his voice cracking loudly as he pointed a shaking finger at me. "You paid someone to break into my company database. That is corporate espionage, Madison. I am going to call the police. I am going to have you arrested for stealing my data." Jamal, who had been standing silently near the edge of the room, let out a deep, frustrated sigh. Brendan Jamal said, his tone laced with heavy exhaustion and profound pity. "Stop making a fool of yourself. She did not hack your servers. Look at the titanium card on the table. Look at the way she is speaking. Connect the dots." Brendan whipped his head around to look at Jamal, then back to me. His chest heaved with rapid, panicked breaths. "Who are you?" Brendan demanded, his voice barely a terrified whisper. "How do you have the Apex Ventures due diligence reports?" I leaned back in my chair, smoothing a non-existent wrinkle from my cheap, faded sweater. "I have the Apex due diligence reports, Brendan," I replied calmly, "because my team is the one who wrote them. And I am the one who read them. I watched your ridiculous pitch presentation 3 weeks ago through a one-way mirror in the executive boardroom while my junior analysts tore your business model apart. You stood there sweating in a cheap suit, lying through your teeth about your user retention rates, while I sat in the dark, deciding whether to crush your company immediately or let you dig your own grave." Beatrice slowly sank back down into her chair, her legs finally giving out completely under the weight of her shattered reality. The grand illusion was entirely gone. There was no more Hampton's estate. There were no more magazine covers. There was only a broke, fraudulent son and the woman holding the absolute power to destroy him. I watched Beatrice slump in her chair, her eyes vacant, as her perfectly constructed world evaporated. But I was not finished. The final nail had to be driven into the coffin so deeply that Brendan could never dig his way out. I reached across the glass table and picked up my encrypted corporate smartphone. The device felt heavy and cool in my hand. I tapped the screen, bypassing the property management application, and opened my secure corporate directory. I selected the direct line for the executive suite at Apex Ventures. I placed the phone back down in the center of the table and pressed the speaker icon. The loud, crisp ringing echoed in the silent room. Brendan watched the phone with wide, bloodshot eyes. He looked like a man standing on the tracks watching the train hurtle directly toward him, completely unable to move his feet. The line connected on the second ring. "Good evening, Miss Reed," a sharp, professional female voice answered. "You have reached the Apex Executive Suite. This is Caroline speaking. How can I assist you tonight?" "Good evening, Caroline," I replied smoothly, my voice projecting the absolute authority of a senior executive. "I need you to pull up the active investment file for Brendan Cole and his associated technology startup." "Right away, Miss Reed," Caroline answered without a single second of hesitation. The sound of rapid keystrokes clicked clearly through the speakerphone. "I have the file open. The Series B term sheet for $10 million is currently in the final stages of approval, pending your signature on Monday morning." "Excellent," I said, leaning back in my chair and crossing my arms over my chest. "I need you to initiate a complete termination of that term sheet, effective immediately. Cancel the $10 million funding round." Caroline did not ask why. She did not express surprise. She simply executed the command. "Term sheet cancelled," Caroline confirmed briskly. "The funding round has been officially aborted. Shall I notify the legal department to draft the formal rejection letter?" "Yes," I instructed, keeping my eyes locked on Brendan. "But before you do that, I need you to execute a secondary directive. I am issuing a priority red flag on Brendan Cole and his entire executive team. I want his company added to the permanent East Coast venture capital blacklist, Send the alert across our entire partner network. Make sure every single institutional investor in New York, Boston, and Silicon Valley receives the notification by midnight. Understood, Miss Reed. Caroline replied, her voice remaining perfectly composed. The red flag has been issued. Brendan Cole is now permanently blacklisted across the partner network. No affiliated firm will accept a pitch meeting from him or his representatives. Is there anything else you require tonight? No, Caroline, that will be all, I said softly. Enjoy the rest of your holiday. I reached forward and tapped the screen, disconnecting the call. The dial tone buzzed briefly before the room plunged back into a suffocating silence. Brendan let out a sound that I could only describe as a dying gasp. It was a pathetic, high-pitched wheeze that tore from the back of his throat. He grabbed his own hair, pulling at the roots, as if physical pain could somehow distract him from his total professional annihilation. "You killed me!" Brendan sobbed, tears streaming freely down his face, dripping off his chin and landing on his expensive silk tie. "You completely destroyed my life. I am ruined. No one will ever invest in me again. The blacklist is a death sentence. I am going to lose the company. I am going to lose everything." He leaned forward, burying his face in his hands, crying loudly like a broken child. I looked at the man sobbing over his spilled wine. "You ruined yourself, Brendan," I said coldly. "I simply refuse to be the collateral damage of your incredible greed. You thought you could trick me into mortgaging my future so you could buy tables in Miami and pretend to be a visionary. You brought a predatory contract to a holiday dinner and tried to bully me into signing away my life. I used my power to ensure you can never victimize another investor or another woman ever again." Ashley was entirely speechless, her jaw hanging open as she watched her brother completely fall apart. Beatrice remained slumped in her chair, staring blankly at the wall, completely broken. The grand Cole family legacy was nothing but dust. The $10 million was gone. Their home was gone. Their entire social standing was obliterated in less than 20 minutes. The empire they thought they were building was just a fragile house of cards, and I had just burned it all to the ground. The silence in the room was heavy, suffocating, and absolute. Brendan's pathetic wet sobs were the only sounds piercing the dead air. I stood up from my chair slowly, the scraping of the wood against the hardwood floor, sounding like a gavel striking a judge's block. I looked down at the ruined, ink-stained prenuptial agreement, then at the heavy titanium card gleaming under the chandelier, and finally at the thoroughly broken family surrounding me. It was time to deliver the absolute final piece of the puzzle. I had dismantled their false reality, but I needed to ensure Brendan Cole never slept soundly another night in his miserable life. I looked down at Brendan. He was peering up at me through his shaking fingers, his eyes red-swollen and completely devoid of his signature arrogance. I smoothed the front of my cheap faded sweater one last time. It was a deliberate mockery of the costume I had worn to expose their true rotting nature. "Brendan," I said, my voice ringing with absolute undeniable authority, "I want you to look at me. I want you to really look at the woman you just spent 2 hours relentlessly degrading." He slowly lowered his hands, his breath hitching painfully in his chest. He was trembling so violently that his expensive suit jacket vibrated against his shoulders. "You have spent the last 6 months sending desperate, pleading emails to a private corporate server." I continued, my words slicing through the room like a scalpel. "You have been begging the senior leadership at Apex Ventures to give you a chance. You practically groveled for a single 15-minute phone call with the head of the investment committee. You sent expensive gift baskets, you sent handwritten letters, and you constantly referenced a mysterious executive you were incredibly desperate to impress. You told your mother you had a secret inside connection." I took a slow, deliberate step toward him, forcing him to crane his neck to maintain eye contact. "I am Madison Reed," I declared, letting each syllable land with the crushing weight of a physical blow. "I am the Chief Operating Officer and the head of investment at Apex Ventures. The mysterious executive you have been begging for money for 6 months via email. Brendan is the exact same woman you just tried to scam out of her apartment lease." The sheer magnitude of the revelation hit him like a speeding freight train. His brain finally connected the final dots, and his body completely gave out. Brendan slipped off the edge of his dining chair and crashed hard onto the hardwood floor, landing directly on his knees. He did not even try to stand back up. He stayed right there on the floor, looking up at me from the exact physical position he now occupied in the corporate world. Absolute rock bottom. He reached out with a trembling hand, grabbing the hem of my cheap canvas bag as if it were a holy relic. "Madison, please," he gasped, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. "You cannot do this. I did not know it was you. If I had known who you really were, I would never have drawn up that contract. I would have treated you like a queen. I swear to you, I will change everything. I will do whatever you want. Please just make the phone call and reverse the blacklist. I am begging you on my knees. Do not take my company." I looked down at him with pure, unfiltered disgust. I stepped backward, forcing his shaking hand to drop from my bag. "That is exactly the point, Brendan," I replied coldly. "You only respect people when you know they have the power to destroy you. You thought I was a poor administrative assistant, so you treated me like disposable garbage. Your true character is exactly what I saw tonight, and your true character is exactly why you will never see a single dime of my money." Suddenly, a loud, ragged wail erupted from the head of the table. Beatrice threw herself forward, her chest hitting the glass table as she reached her arms out toward me. The haughty, untouchable aristocratic matriarch was entirely gone. Her expensive makeup was running down her face in thick black streaks, and her perfectly styled hair was a tangled mess. "Madison, please forgive us," Beatrice sobbed loudly, her voice echoing with raw, unadulterated terror. "We were so incredibly wrong. We were foolish and arrogant. Please do not take our home. We have nowhere else to go. I will apologize to you every single day for the rest of my life. I will scrub your floors. I will get on my hands and knees right now. Please do not throw us out into the street. You are a kind woman. You are a powerful woman. Please show us mercy." I stared at the weeping, pathetic woman, feeling absolutely nothing but a profound sense of closure. "You did not offer me any mercy when you handed me that predatory contract, Beatrice," I reminded her sharply. "You sat there and promised to destroy my pathetic little career. You threatened to have me fired and blacklisted just to satisfy your own twisted ego. You demanded I hand over my weekly grocery receipts while you actively tried to steal my financial future. You built this trap entirely by yourselves, and now you get to live in it." I turned my back on Beatrice completely. I let her desperate pleas dissolve into the stagnant air of the dining room, entirely unaffected by the pathetic display of a woman mourning her own manufactured royalty. Brendan was still weeping on the floor, his hands gripping the expensive rug, absolutely shattered by the realization that his entire future had just been erased by a single phone call. Ashley remained frozen in her chair, her tear-streaked face pale and hollow, finally understanding that her days of country club lunches and designer shopping sprees were permanently over. I did not waste another breath on any of them. They were no longer my problem. They were simply an unpleasant financial transaction that had been successfully canceled. I walked around the massive glass table, my cheap thrift store shoes clicking softly against the hardwood floor. I bypassed the weeping mother and the broken son, stopping only when I stood directly in front of Jamal. He had not moved since he stepped away from his wife. He stood tall, his hands resting in the pockets of his tailored trousers, watching the absolute destruction of his toxic in-laws, with a quiet, undeniable sense of vindication. He looked at me, no longer seeing a poor administrative assistant, but recognizing the corporate predator I truly was. There was no fear in his eyes, only a deep, profound respect. I reached into the velvet-lined security pocket of my canvas tote bag one final time. I bypassed the platinum fountain pen and the heavy titanium credit card, extracting a sleek, heavy piece of matte black cardstock. It was my official corporate business card. The Apex Ventures logo was deeply embossed in solid gold foil, catching the light of the chandelier. I held it out to him. Jamal looked at the gold lettering, then up at my face. He slowly pulled his hand from his pocket and accepted the card. The heavy paper felt substantial, a tangible lifeline out of the nightmare he had been living for the past 5 years. "You are incredibly sharp, Jamal," I said, my voice dropping to a calm professional register that easily cut through the background noise of Beatrice sobbing. "You were the only person in this entire house who possessed the basic intelligence to read a balance sheet and the moral compass to call out a federal crime. You are far too smart and far too talented to go down with this rapidly sinking ship." I glanced briefly at Ashley, who was watching us with wide, terrified eyes. She realized I was offering her husband the exact golden ticket she had just lost. "Divorce her," I instructed Jamal, locking my eyes back onto his. "Cut ties with this fraudulent family before Brendan's inevitable federal indictment drags your pristine reputation into the mud. Once the divorce papers are filed, call the private number on the back of that card. It goes directly to my personal human resources director. Tell him Madison Reed sent you. I have an open vice president of marketing position at a highly profitable portfolio company in Manhattan. The starting salary is triple whatever you are making right now, and it comes with full equity." Jamal stared at the gold-embossed card in his hand. A slow, genuine smile spread across his face, entirely erasing the exhaustion that had weighed him down all evening. He looked at Ashley, severing the final emotional thread that tied him to her toxicity, then looked back at me. "I will make the call on Monday morning," Jamal said, his voice ringing with absolute certainty. "Thank you, Madison." I gave him a single professional nod. I turned away and walked back to my chair. I raised my left hand and looked at the cheap cubic zirconia engagement ring Brendan had given me. He had claimed he spent thousands on it, but I knew he had bought it on clearance to save cash for his Miami nightclub trips. I slid the worthless piece of metal off my finger. Brendan looked up from the floor, his red eyes watching my every move. I held the ring directly over his crystal wine glass. I let go. The fake diamond hit the dark red wine with a sharp, hollow plink. The liquid splashed up, staining the sides of the expensive glass. It was the perfect metaphor for his entire existence. A cheap, worthless illusion drowning in its own mess. I picked up my canvas bag, turned on my heel, and walked out of the dining room without a single backward glance. The heavy oak front door swung open easily under my hand. The cool, crisp night air washed over my face, completely erasing the suffocating stench of the Cole family mansion. Waiting silently at the end of the long cobblestone driveway was a sleek, midnight black Maybach. The engine hummed with a quiet, immense power. A sharply dressed chauffeur immediately stepped out, opening the heavy rear door and bowing his head respectfully as I approached. I climbed into the plush leather interior, sinking into the quiet luxury I had earned through years of relentless hard work. The chauffeur closed the door, sealing out the world outside. As the Maybach glided smoothly out of the gated community I now owned, leaving the ruined, weeping family far behind in the darkness, I pulled out my secure phone to review my Monday morning schedule. It was time to get back to work. What would you have done if you were in Madison's shoes? Would you have destroyed the Cole family the exact same way? Or would you have walked away earlier? Let us know your thoughts in the comments section below. If you enjoyed this satisfying story of ultimate corporate revenge, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell so you never miss another upload. Thank you so much for watching, and we will see you in the next video.